Good day, everybody. Thank you all for joining us here today for one of Climate Analytics events as part of this year's New York Climate Week. The road to Glasgow, what needs to happen by COP26 to keep 1.5 goal alive? My name is Fran Fuller, and I'm the Director of New York Office of Climate Analytics. I would first like to remind you of a few housekeeping rules or points. We're 18 months into online world, and so I'm sure you are well versed, but please note that this session is being recorded. Please keep yourselves muted unless you are presenting or speaking on the panel. We have the Q&A function available for all participants, and please feel free to put your questions in there. If you have them specifically to an individual person, please make sure that that's noted. And I encourage our guests to continue to answer them as we go along through the session. While I'll be taking questions in the end towards the event, we're encouraging to continue to answer them as long as we go along. For those of you who may not know us already, Climate Analytics is a nonprofit motivated by the desire to empower those most vulnerable, especially small island developing states and least developed countries. We undertake extensive research on the 1.5 temperature limit of the Paris Agreement and the risk and vulnerabilities these countries face. We also evaluate progress on climate action and show governments how they can act on their policies to keep this limit alive. We have offices in Germany, Australia, Nepal, Togo, Trinidad and Tobago, and here in New York City. I don't need to remind everybody in the room here today about the latest findings of the IPCC Working Group 1 report. Our presenters will do that. But I will remind you that we are in a moment of great challenge, but we are also here with great opportunity. There's a glimmer of hope, and with aggressive action this decade, not next, the IPCC science tells us that 1.5 long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement can stay within reach. Stringent mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions brings immediate benefit, and limiting global warming to 1.5 will dramatically reduce future climate risks. Just in the past week, we've had a flurry of publications, events, and announcements from the newly released UNFCCC NDC synthesis report, the OECD report on climate finance provided and mobilized by developed countries, the UN Secretary General's Leaders event, China's announcement to stop funding build out of new coal-fired plants overseas, and just yesterday, the Alliance of Small Island States Leaders Summit, adoption of a new declaration. We have many partners on board with increasing ambition, including our distinguished guests here today, but we have a long way to go, and we do need all hands on deck. Our event here will bring together experts and government representatives to unpack some of these issues. And to start the discussions, I would like to first hand over to introduce introductory remarks by my good friend, Special Advisor and Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change, Selwin Hart. As a fellow islander, I know that you're such a staunch supporter of the most vulnerable and of driving ambition. ASG Hart, over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller. Always a pleasure to see colleagues. And we're about 40 days ahead of COP26 in Glasgow, but about 54, 55 days before COP ends. We really need to use every day, every hour, every minute, every second effectively to ensure that COP26 in Glasgow truly represents that turning point in our collective effort to address the climate crisis. So while today's event is very focused on keeping the 1.5 degree goal within reach, it's absolutely essential that we also look at the broader package that needs to be delivered at Glasgow that helps us to ensure that Glasgow, as I said earlier, represents that turning point where we see accelerated action across the board on mitigation, on ambition, finance. And this is why the Secretary General really has been advocating that Glasgow must deliver on ambition across the board, mitigation, on finance, and on adaptation. And the reality is that we're not on pace. We're not on track to deliver the ambition needed, that it protect people, to protect livelihoods, and also to ensure climate security across the world. So despite what we've seen from all of the recent reports from the IPCC report, and I know colleagues will address this, the IPCC report says that we're not in a very good place, but that the window of opportunity to hold the increase in global temperature to 0.5 degrees Celsius, it remains within reach. It will require unprecedented and aggressive action over the course of the next decade to put us on that path. We recently also received a report from the UNFCCC which shows that the cumulative impact of the nationally determined contributions or indices that have been put on the table, rather than showing a decrease of 45% by 2030 over 2010 levels that would put us on that 1.5 degree pathway, we're seeing an increase in emissions of 16%. So we're not in a good place, but all hope is not lost. I still believe that Glasgow can provide us with a signal that the world is truly turning the corner on 1.5 degrees. So what do we need to see to provide us with that hope, or to keep that hope alive? First, we really need to acknowledge that there is a gap, and there will be a gap. We will not see we will not see national commitments that are consistent, fully consistent with the 1.5 degree pathway. So when we do the math, when you talented scientists out there do the math, we will not have indices that account for a reduction of 45% below 2010 levels. There will be a gap. The question is how big that gap is. So we need to continue in these 40 days ahead of Glasgow, 54 days before the end of the COP. We really need to press all countries, especially the major emitters, to place their nationally determined contributions on the table. Those have already submitted, some of them resubmitted old indices. We need to press them to have a second look and come to the table with more ambitious number, so that we can at least have some indication on how big this gap is and what action needs to be next. At Glasgow, we really need to see the outcomes at Glasgow. Really, the signal must be sent that attacking this gap and raising ambition in the 2020s, not the 2030s or after, but attacking this gap in the 2020s over the course of the next few years must be priority number one. Governments need to signal that they will be revisited, not in 5-year increments, but as frequently as possible, increasing the ambition level of their nationally determined contributions. And this is particularly important for the big emitters. Yes, the principle of common but differentiated responsibility in light of national circumstances, it remains a key component behind the regime. But all countries, especially including emerging economies, developed countries must be, but all countries must contribute to global effort. And the Secretary General has stressed it. You would see that it was contained a key component of his summary of a closed door roundtable that he had on Monday. So there needs to be this focus on the large economies. How we signal on coal will be absolutely crucial for success at Glasgow. As the IPCC states, coal or phasing out coal is the most significant step that we can take to end the 1.5, to keep 1.5 alive. And this is why the Secretary General has been extremely aggressive, dated 3 years back, in calling for the rapid phase out. OECD countries must phase out by 2030. We know in the G7 communique, there was some fuzzy language of in the 2030s. They need to bring this forward. No OECD country should be using coal after 2030. This is what leadership looks like. So we're really pressing the OECD countries, especially the G7 to accelerate their coal phase-out plan. This is what leadership looks like. We're very encouraged by the recent announcement from China that it will no longer finance international plant overseas. This has the potential to make a significant dent in the expansion of coal in the developing world. At present, just 5 countries account for about 80% of the planned coal pipeline globally. Those countries, those developing countries, must be supported, and finance must be mobilized to provide these countries with cheaper, cleaner, renewable energy alternative, given that they need energy to grow and develop and attain the same living standards as developed world. So I think with all of these components, we can send in a very credible way, and it must be credible, right? Young people will not accept false promises. Young people will not accept us trying to pay for failure. We must send a very credible signal that the 1.5 degree goal remains within reach. We must ensure that we acknowledge that there is a gap, but we also must be crystal clear in what we will do to ensure that that gap is closed over the course of this critical decade. So, Francis, thank you so much for this invitation. The Secretary General is very energized. He intends to use all of his convening power to play an honest broker role as well in order to ensure that we can have success at Glasgow. But we need all hands on deck, as correctly said, to ensure that Glasgow truly represents that turning point in our collective efforts to address, confront the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ASG Hart, for those remarks and for yours and the Secretary General's tireless efforts towards keeping 1.5 alive. We look forward to seeing your efforts come to fruition towards COP and beyond. Thank you very much. And so now we are going to turn over to our presenters from Climate Analytics to set the scene. And we will start with Dr. Carl-Friedrich Schleussner on the science, then move to Claire Fyson speaking on the role of the G20 in keeping to 1.5. And finally, Marie-Camille, who will present on what does each country need to do to be on a domestic 1.5 pathway, highlighting a couple of countries. Carl is the head of our climate science at Climate Analytics and the group lead at Humboldt University, Berlin. He is an expert, long-standing expertise in climate modeling and climate impact science, multi-year experience in providing scientific advice at climate policy interface, including the UNFCCC process. Claire is our co-lead of the climate policy team and leading on climate analytics work for mitigation pathways analysis. And Marie-Camille is a climate policy analyst contributing to the climate action tracker with a particular interest in assessing countries' emission trajectories and sectoral transition pathways. Carl, over to you.
Thank you very much, Francis, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone from Berlin. It's a pleasure to be presenting to you today and to give you a very brief overview of what truly is a landmark report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, providing us with the latest understanding of the biophysical climate science just ahead of this pivotal political moment. Next slide, please. So what we have gotten there from the scientific community is really a monumental effort synthesizing information of thousands of scientific publications with the contributions of hundreds of researchers from around the globe, and then eventually being approved by government line by line in summary for policymakers. It is the first of a series of assessment reports covering different areas of the climate problem, this one dealing with the physical science base. And early next year, we will see 2 more assessment reports forthcoming from the climate impacts and vulnerability perspective from Working Group 2 and the mitigation and solution aspects presented in Working Group 3. So this is really focusing on our physical understanding of the climate system. Nevertheless, since climate change is eventually a problem that very much has its roots in the way we are changing the physics of this planet, the physical understanding really provides the basis for everything and all policies that we intend to pursue. Next slide, please. I'll talk you through some key findings of the report and some key messages. Just to set the scene a little bit, the report is very, very clear that climate change is here now. Humans are responsible, and it's unequivocal that this is indeed the case. We have a much improved understanding of the severity of climate change today, but also at 1.5 degrees and every increment of increasing warming, but also a much improved understanding of the effectiveness of mitigation, which is very important for designing targeted climate policies. We have a lot of remarkable consistency also in relation to the central findings of the 1.5 degree special report of the IPCC that was published in 2018. And we have a lot of new findings, in particular in relation to low probability but high impact climate risks, such as the crossing of tipping points of ice sheets, or else that could lead to irreversible long-term impacts, in particular in the domain of sea level rise. Lastly, but certainly not least important, is that we do have a better understanding and an ever improved understanding of how stringent mitigation will have rapid and sustained benefits on reducing human-induced climate change that will pay off in the near term, and therefore the benefits of our actions will show or not over the decades to come, and not just in the later half of the 21st century. To talk you through some of these aspects in some greater detail, to just set the scene a little bit based on the latest science. Next slide, please. I just want to start with where we are today. Climate change is here now. And what we are seeing and observing in the climate system is unparalleled over thousands to millions of years. CO2 concentrations are assessed to potentially be the highest in 2 million years. Temperatures for tens of thousands of years. Sustained levels of global surface temperature, as in the last decade, have not been seen on this planet for more than 100,000 years. So this is a really monumental understanding of where we've brought climate change to already, and it's no surprise that as a result, we also see widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere that have occurred, are observed, and can be attributed and linked to climate change, as well as changes in extreme events in every region across the globe. Not all extremes are changing everywhere the same way, but this is a very significant finding of understanding where we are as we speak today. The IPCC has assessed a set of 5 illustrative emission scenarios. They are not comprehensive in nature, they are really illustrative in nature, and it is not the role of the physical science community to assess all possible future climate outcomes. And my colleagues, just following up of my presentation, will speak some more about different scenarios of reaching the 1.5 degree limit. But what is very important is that these scenarios and the key findings are consistent with the analysis provided in the special report on 1.5 degrees of the IPCC 3 years ago, and it includes a low emission scenario, SSP 119, that illustrates a future that keeps 1.5 degrees within reach. It requires deep emission reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions immediately, and to achieve net zero CO2 emissions around mid-century. Next slide, please. One key finding of the report is really also in relation to the revisions of sea level rise estimates. For many years, the scientists have questioned some of the estimates of the IPCC as being rather on the conservative side. And indeed, some of the new science that has come forward and has been assessed in this report shows much higher potential risks of extreme sea level rise already this century and beyond, compared to what previous assessments have shown. So in a very extreme scenario that shows very high emissions, but also the crossing of dangerous tipping points of the Western Arctic and potentially the Greenland ice sheet, there's a risk of sea level rise of up to 2 meters in this century that cannot be excluded or ruled out. And if you then compare towards the right of the slide, as you see the projections up to 2300, so 300 years into the future, you see the risk of multi-meter sea level rise and up to 15 meters in such an extreme scenario where such tipping points are being crossed. This, of course, exceeds adaptive capacities of coastal communities around the globe, small islands, but also not just low-lying vulnerable regions, but pretty much every coastal region that there is. and illustrates the enormous risks that climate change and in particular also sea level rise poses on the medium to long run for communities everywhere, and the enormous benefits of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Compared to 2 degrees in the long run, it could avoid up to 3 meters of sea level rise when by limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Next slide, please. Clearly, the report shows that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees would strongly reduce climate risks across the board, be it sea level rise that I've just shown, but also the frequency and intensity of a range of dangerous extremes, hot extremes, marine heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts, tropical cyclones, and so on, which will ever increase with ongoing warming and substantially increase if warming of 1.5 degrees is to be exceeded. Every fraction of a degree matters, as the IPCC is continuing to remind us. And just to highlight, as we have seen several of these events this year and their disastrous consequences also in highly developed countries, the likelihood of unprecedented extremes will also ever increase with increasing warming. So events like we have seen in Europe, in China, or also in the northwest of the US will just become ever more frequent as long as warming continues. Next slide, please. An important aspect that the report is ever more certain, or the IPCC is ever more certain, is that achieving net zero CO2 is a precondition to halt global warming. So it is really the condition that we need to achieve, and it is therefore encouraging to see more and more net zero commitments coming forward aligned with this very fundamental physical finding. It also means that there is a limited carbon budget that can be emitted up to that point. And the IPCC has shown, let's say, under the hood, has found a lot of improvements in terms of its estimates of future warming outcomes, and they are much constrained to compare to previous assessments, and illustrate provide a much higher certainty on the effectiveness of emission reductions. So it is really a problem that we are causing, but a problem that humanity can also and is still in the driving seat to address and to fix. And emissions in line with the 1.5 degree limit would rapidly limit climate change and would show immediate effects on greenhouse gas and aerosol concentrations within a few years, but also in terms of global temperature over the next 2 decades, slowing down anthropogenic warming, therefore reducing the pressure of communities and ecosystems to adapt. Action in the next decade, well beyond what current indices imply, is decisive, and my previous speaker has already alluded very much to that point. But it is important to also be clear that the science shows that this will not just pay off in terms of co-benefits and other measures, but also the climate system will show us immediate benefits from such stringent action. How this is to be done will be presented by my next speakers. So I'm happy to hand over now and leave it there, looking forward to the discussion later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carl. So we're gonna now look into a tool that we've released a couple of months ago, which looks actually to what each country should be doing individually to be on a domestic 1.5 emissions pathway. So we started this project a year and a half ago, a project funded by the IKEA Foundation on the observation of some key gaps. So first, when we have global Paris Agreement compatible pathways at the global level, they are often, for many countries, not available at national level. And similarly, and sadly, current indices and policies are still not sufficient to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. On the right side, we have the climate action tracker thermometers, which shows us that current policies are heading towards 2.9 degrees and pledged targets to 2.4 degrees. So we are unfortunately not there yet. So what we hope with this tool on the next slide, what we hope with this tool is to provide support and key resources to stakeholders in the development of their nationally determined contributions, so their NDCs and their long-term strategies. We look into as well national benchmarks for key sectors, mostly the energy sectors, so power, industry, buildings, to support the development of sectoral policies in to actually reach those targets. So when we go on the next slide, so what do we look at? The starting point are those global model assessed by the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees and some other lines of evidence, which we filter based on sustainability criteria as defined by the reports, by the special report on 1.5 degree. Then we downscale from a regional perspective. So here you have the example of Northern Africa to country level results. So for example, Morocco and Egypt. And so when we go on the next slide. So what we are looking in this project, in this tool, are domestic emissions trajectories. So what does that mean? From the perspective of developed countries, these emissions reductions are the one expected to be achieved within their borders. But on top of that, they will need to provide support to developing countries to additionally reduce emissions abroad. Whereas from a developing country's perspective, these emissions reductions are still what needs to happen domestically. However, in many cases, they go beyond their fair share. So in this case, they will need to receive support to bridge this gap to reduce this amount of emissions. And we have recently, the Climate Action Tracker, about 2 weeks ago, released a new rating system and a new analysis, which provide perspective on domestic emissions pathway and fair share as well. So we launched this tool around 2 months ago in June. We aim to assess around 70 countries. You have most of them showed now on this slide, and we aim to cover most of all the continents. When you go on the next slide. So what do we look at the country level analysis? We look at what we derive from the global models, economy-wide emissions pathways at national level for greenhouse gas emissions as well as CO2 emissions, all of them excluding land use and forestry at this stage. We analyze, so far you will find online on the web tool, the power sector as a starting point, and the fuel shares and fossil fuel phase out derived from the global model. So when coal should be phased out, when gas should be phased out in a given country. Then we look at as well, when should the sector be fully decarbonized. As already said a bit previously, we look at those domestic emissions pathway, which is the blue shaded area you see on the right side of the slide, assuming for developing countries that they receive finance to close this emissions gap. Our policy analysts and our modeling team are working very hard right now. We are hoping to release by end of this year additional sectors analysis, so industry, transport and buildings. And for early 2022, we hope to complete the assessment to provide what investment requirements will be needed for the transformation of the power sector together with land use and forestry pathways for key countries. So I'm going to give now an example, 3 examples of G20 countries before my colleague Claire Fyson will go after on the G20 as a group. When we look at Canada, so you have on the right side of the graph, so you can see the 1.5 degree emissions pathway, the blue shaded area, and on the right side of the graph, a sort of snapshot of the 2030 emissions level with the current policy projections, the NDC, and the blue part, the 1.5 emissions level. So Canada is still, unfortunately, quite an ambition gap of around 110 megaton, aiming at reducing emissions of 36 to 41% in 2030, when models are showing rather 52 to 63% below 2005 levels by 2030. On the longer term, so it's still unclear how Canada aims to rely on its land sink to reach its net zero target. But models are showing, when we exclude land use and forestry emissions, are showing emissions reductions by mid-century of around 88 to 94%, meaning that to balance, the country will need to balance its remaining emissions by no more of 29 megaton of sink. So that will be a space to watch out. I said previously, in this case, Canada, on top of these emissions reductions, will need to provide support to other countries to reduce additional emissions overseas. When now we look into South Korea, we observe the same pattern where we have quite a significant ambition gap. When we compare on the right side, you see the domestic target of South Korea, estimated at 90% below 2017 level in 2030. when 1.5 degree compatible pathways are showing rather emissions reductions of 55 to 66%. So the country has, however, announced that he will be revising its updated NDC and potentially submit an updated NDC in October, so in a couple of weeks. So all our hopes and expectations are there. And now to finish, I will show an example of the analysis we do regarding the power sector in the case of South Africa, for which the cabinet has approved this week a more ambitious emissions reductions target than the one which was submitted in as draft NDC in March for consultation. So that's a positive development. Models are showing that to get on board the 1.5 compatible pathways, the power sector should be fully decarbonized between 2036 and 2040, driven by mostly a coal phase out in early 2030s and a sharp increase in renewable energies in the next decade. But decarbonization of the power sector will bring huge opportunities to create socio-economic benefits, mostly by avoiding stranded fossil fuel assets and the associated job losses. We are seeing now that there is more and more announcements of countries moving away from fossil fuel that will help the country to prepare its economy when fossil fuel will be phased out. And it's also the opportunity to advance on its SDGs with reducing air pollution and the burden that it generates on the health system, together with providing a cheaper electricity to the people. With that, I will pass it on to my colleague Claire Fyson, who will look at the G20 as a group. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Marie-Camille. Yeah, so with a very narrow window for action, we took a look at what the G20 countries, this very powerful group of countries that make up 80% of the world's GDP and almost 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions, what impact they could have if they were all to pull their weight on addressing climate change. Marie-Camille has set out, and Carl have set out the context here, that we're currently way off track. The synthesis report says we're still not doing enough, as Marie-Camille highlighted. Also, the climate action tracker says we're on track for 2.4 or even 2.9 degrees of warming under current policies. So really, what impact could the G20 countries have on getting us closer to 1.5? This is something that we looked into with WRI and we published very recently. So we looked at what would happen if all G20 countries were to set 2030 targets that are in line with domestic 1.5 compatible pathways, so those pathways that Marie-Camille just outlined. And at the same time, what would happen if they were to also set net zero targets for mid-century? So that includes the existing net zero targets that some G20 members have brought forward, but we also made some assumptions. What if those developed countries that haven't yet put forward such a target were to set net zero greenhouse gas emissions for 2050, and those developing G20 countries were to set net zero carbon dioxide targets for 2050. And we took a look at what this could mean for global emissions pathways out into the future, and also for global warming. And in the next slide, you can see the results of this analysis. So this shows emissions pathways out to 2100 for each of the scenarios that we looked at. The blue bar, the dark blue bar there, shows the critical decade for action that we need to really be focusing on. If you look at the red line, I think, Kaiser, you can just step through with me, you'll see the labels. Yeah, so the red line shows where we were as of December 2019, the previous set of targets of NDCs, taking us to 2.8 degrees of warming. The orange then shows where current commitments, current NDCs and net zero targets that are in law would take us to 2.4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. The yellow is a more optimistic take of what current commitments it could take us to. This includes the announcements made, for example, by China for its new NDC, but also announced net zero targets that haven't yet been formalized into law. This could take us to 2.1 degrees, so getting closer, but still not enough. And in the green is the result of our analysis that shows what if all G20 countries were to step up and bring forward 1.5 aligned 2030 targets and net zero targets. And there you can see a very steep drop over the next decade, and end century warming limited to 1.7 degrees. And so that change from the 2.4 in the orange to the 1.7 in the green, that's all as a result of G20 action. And that takes us about 3/4 of the way to 1.5. In the next slide, we focus in on the 2030 period. So Selwin really highlighted the emissions gap that we're currently faced with between where we're heading under current targets and where we need to be on a 1.5 degree pathway. You can see that big red bar is the emissions gap, 29 gigatons as of December 2019. So under the previous set of targets, we've made some progress in narrowing that gap. So the orange and yellow show the current targets and the announced targets that have been made recently. I should say this doesn't include South Africa's very recent announcement. So that now takes off about 6 gigatons. And then that big green block, so it's about 2/3 reduction in the emissions gap, could happen if the G20 were to put forward 1.5 aligned domestic emissions reductions targets. So a really, really important contribution potentially from the G20 countries. And in the next slide, we can see how this breaks down by country. So this is for each country, what share of that emissions gap do they currently make up? And you can see there that China, India, Russia, Indonesia, and the US make up the largest share of that gap. The dark blue shows the current and announced targets, and the light blue shows where we were at the previous set of targets. So you can also see in this graph that some countries, such as the US, the EU, Japan, South Africa, and the UK, have made good progress. And potentially China, if they submit their announced NDC, that they have made progress in narrowing this gap. But still a big gap remains for a number of these countries. Now, it's important to remember that this is only part of the picture. As Marie-Camille said, this is really looking at what countries should be doing domestically. But of course, for this to be realized, for all of these countries to narrow these gaps, we would need finance to flow from developed countries to developing countries, because this does not take into account what a fair share contribution from each of these countries would be. And in the next slide, I've highlighted what the Climate Action Tracker has given as a rating for each of these countries. The Climate Action Tracker has a new rating system, which we've been working on over the last year or so, which takes into account not only what a country is doing domestically, but also what it's doing from a fair share perspective. And you can see that across the board, we don't have a very positive look here. Most countries are insufficient or even critically insufficient in some cases. And what's important to note here is if you look at the UK, looking at just the domestic emissions gap alone, the UK has closed this to 0. So the UK has a domestic target that is aligned with a domestic 1.5 emissions trajectory, but it's not yet 1.5 compatible. And that's because the UK is not yet doing its fair share and would need to provide a substantial amount of climate finance in order to meet its fair share. And in the next slide, I've shown the climate finance ratings that the Climate Action Tracker gives to developed countries. And here you can see that the United Kingdom is highly insufficient. And so that's why its overall rating is not yet 1.5 compatible. So yeah, in the last slide, then I would summarize what we found from this study. So we found that really all countries need to step up with stronger targets to get to 1.5, to keep 1.5 within reach. But of course, the G20 have an absolutely fundamental role to play there. They could, if they were to all pull their weight and put 1.5 aligned targets forward, this could get us 3/4 of the way to 1.5. Unfortunately, we're not yet there. So the Climate Action Tracker found that no G20 country is yet 1.5 compatible. And in the map, you can see that several G20 countries have still either not yet submitted a new NDC, as shown in the gray, or have submitted an NDC that is weaker or the same as a previous target, and that's shown in the orange and the red. And not all G20 countries have brought forward a net zero target either. So there's a really important work to be done by this group. And of course, in parallel, we need the developed countries to be stepping up with their climate finance commitments to make the steep emissions reductions that we need across the board possible. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. So I'll hand back to Fran.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Marie-Camille and Carl, for your presentations and for setting the scene so well. I would like to now turn to our panel discussion. So we have our presenters, and then we also have two very distinguished guests. First, we have Sonam Phuntsho Wangdi, Secretary of the National Environment Commission for the Royal Government of Bhutan and the chair of the Least Developed Countries Group. We also have on the line Honorable Simon Stiell, who's the Minister of Climate Resilience and the Environment of Grenada. Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. So first, Chair, I would like to turn to you. So given the backdrop of the presentations, what are some of the key issues for LDCs as we move towards COP26, and some of the concrete steps from your perspective that need to be taken between now and the COP to ensure that we keep the 1.5 goal alive? We had a question in the chat that came up from somebody in Nepal, said that, do we really believe that powerful countries are ready to step up to the plate and do what we expect them to undertake? So if you could take that into consideration as you respond, that would be great. Over to you.
Thank you, Francis. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Minister Stiell, distinguished participants, colleagues at Climate Analytics, thank you for having me. Let me begin by thanking Climate Analytics for organizing this important event and sharing with us the findings from the latest IPCC report and analysis done by the experts at Climate Analytics. I would also like to thank Climate Analytics for producing regular assessments and analytical tools. That has been very helpful information and knowledge material for us to engage in the negotiation process. Among others, the recent G20 report with the analysis of implications of action taken by G20 countries presented just now was a stark reminder on the role of major economies and major emitters to respond to the climate crisis. As it was presented at the beginning, the latest IPCC Assessment Report 6, Working Group 1, confirms that the world has warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius due to human-made climate change. The report also confirmed that 1.5 degree limit agreed in Paris is still within reach, which requires deep and sustained emission reductions to decline by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero by around 2050. The recent synthesis report released by the UNFCCC Secretariat shows that the level of ambition presented to date in the revised NDCs is inadequate, which was also raised by Ambassador Hart, which put it at 16.3 degrees above 2010 levels. So these are the NDCs of 191 parties. So we are really, it's still on the rise instead of the reduction. In the same way, in a recent report by the International Renewable Energy, IRENA, states that despite clear evidence of human-caused climate change, widespread support for the Paris Agreement and prevalence for clean, economic, and sustainable energy options, energy-related CO2 emission increased by 1.3% annually on an average between 2014 and 2019. This clearly shows that the reductions fall far short of what is required to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, demonstrating the need for parties to further strengthen their mitigation commitments under the Paris Agreement. Therefore, NDC updates need to continue in advance of COP at Glasgow. Those countries that have not improved their target need to rethink. Ambition in NDCs must be increased at least fivefold to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. If emissions are not rapidly reduced in this decade, this would raise the risk of dangerous and irreversible impacts on the natural and human systems. This will expose the most vulnerable of us, including the LDCs in particular, to unacceptable levels of risk. The world cannot afford to leave Glasgow without a set of revised NDCs that closes the ambition gap and keeps the 1.5 degree goal within reach. On the road towards COP26, in the remaining few weeks, we must see more ambitious NDCs delivered, which reflect each country's highest possible ambition, as well as long-term strategies that map the path towards a net zero world by 2050. long-term strategy is a must for the credibility of how countries plan to align with and achieve the overall objectives of the Paris Agreement, including ensuring 1.5 degrees Celsius. The invitation, which ended in 2020, should be extended because visionary and transformational planning and actions are essential if the world is to limit global average warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The remaining work under the Paris Rulebook, namely the rules on the carbon market, a decision on common time frame, and remaining elements under enhanced transparency framework must be finalized at COP26 to ensure transparency, safeguard environmental integrity, and deliver more ambition. Further, in insufficient ambition of current NDC pledges, we should not allow the use of pre-2020 units against NDCs. Developed countries also need to significantly scale up their climate finance, as many developing countries will only be able to meet ambitious 1.5 degree compatible pathways with significant support from developed countries. A recent finding by the International Energy Agency confirms that only 2% of fiscal support in response to COVID-19 is going to clean energy. And that investment on clean energy is only 35% of what is needed to put us on a pathway to net zero by 2050. The finance need in developing countries is to deal with the current level of impacts and implement low carbon initiatives, low carbon initiative is much higher. However, mobilization of support is no way near the US 100 billion as committed a long time ago. It is welcoming that the US recently pledged to double its contribution to climate action. However, apart from a handful of developed countries, still many rich nations are lagging behind to fulfill their commitment to close the global funding gap. Let me conclude with a note that to meet the urgency in reducing global emissions, we reiterate our call for countries to strengthen their 2030 targets consistent with 1.5 degree pathways ahead of COP26. Parties need to step up the ambition plate between now and Glasgow. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, for that very clear direction as we head towards COP. And I imagine you'll have the similar ambition coming out of the COP towards the 5th UN Conference on LDCs in January 2022. So we look forward to seeing how the progression of LDCs go forward, especially after the COP. Minister, similar question to you. From the perspective of Grenada, a small island developing state, what are some of the critical issues that you see that are required for us to keep on a 1.5 pathway and to keep that alive as we move forward towards COP? But in addition, I just wanted to ask you to touch on another question that's come up in the chat, that are you seeing developing nations viewing reaching 1.5 goal as a chance to leapfrog from technological and development standpoint, throwing your weight towards a green future? I know that you spoke a little bit to this in the AOSIS Leaders Summit yesterday as it relates to SIDS NDCs that have been submitted. So if you could touch on that as well as you respond. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Fran. I hope you hear me. I've had some technology problems as you mentioned technology. Been having some technology problems. So I'm here in my hotel room in New York, attending Climate Week. I mean, my comments, Fran, mirrored in all those that have spoken before me. The clear message is that action needs to be taken now, and the window of opportunity that's being presented to us has narrowed to a very thin point. 3 important reports, the IPCC report, which tells us that the Earth is heating far faster than previously predicted. The impacts are far greater, action required more. and the time available to us is exceedingly narrow, then the synthesis report has simply doubled down on that in giving us inventory of where we are in terms of submitted NDCs, that what has been submitted to date is highly insufficient. Selwin called a figure, instead of us being on target for a 45% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, what is projected based on what is currently on the table is a 16% increase. And then there is the OECD report, which speaks to where we are with climate financing, and the fact that instead of the promised 100 billion, the last assessment in 2019 showed that less than 80 billion has been mobilized. Now, that's notwithstanding some of the positive statements that have been made by the US, by China this week. So the US's pledge to double its contribution to 11.4 billion is a positive signal. It still requires Congress's approval, so still subject to their domestic political machinations. And then China's pledge to cease building coal-fired power stations abroad, and its scaling up of support to developing countries in their renewable energy transitions, again, very welcome. But they also cannot lose focus in terms of their own domestic production and what needs to be done there if they are to be 1.5 aligned. So these are all positive signals, but still not enough. It was mentioned the role of the G20 in all of this. And again, Claire's presentation outlined quite clearly that within the G20, they are responsible for 80% of global emissions. So we know who needs to act. The G20 represents 85% of global GDP. So we know where the wealth and the technical capacity lies to take the necessary action. So we know who, we know what, and we know when they need to act. But coming back to where we are with the IPCC report, the synthesis report, OECD report, we are nowhere near where we need to be. I'm hearing softening of language as we approach Glasgow, but that's language. What these reports are telling us is that the corresponding action that is required for us to achieve what we collectively need to achieve is still not there. So as Selwin said in his statement, we still have a very, very long way to go. And what is required is unprecedented action. So when we look at what is required for Glasgow, the closing of agreement on the Paris rule book with integrity intact, so that that rule book ensures that that framework channels us all collectively down that 1.5 pathway. The raising of the 100 billion and the need for adaptation to be placed firmly on the agenda. These are all a given. These should actually not be extraordinary outcomes. This is simply fulfilling what was agreed in 2015 in Paris. To really call this, to state that there is an ambitious outcome, has to speak to the phasing out of coal and clear positions taken by those who are the ones who can make the greatest impact in terms of phasing out coal production. And the removal of fuel subsidies. My colleague before me said, what was it, 2% of COVID recovery investment in green, in carbon neutral programs. You know, that is a missed opportunity. So, and part of that is the subsidizing of non-carbon friendly programs, and the firm establishment of carbon markets, the common claims, the issue of loss and damage. This is something that developed countries have avoided for that period coming out of Paris. And it's something that needs to be firmly placed on the agenda beyond just agreeing on the Santiago network. We have to go far beyond that. And then kind of focusing on what is really important to Grenada, what is important to all small island developing states, the mitigation side. Our contribution to achieving the 1.5 is a moral one, not a practical one. We are low carbon emitters. It is for the G20 to take the necessary action. But what is critical for us is the adaptation agenda. And when we look at the Paris Agreement, when we look at the provisions within that agreement for adaptation, I think we as developing nations, small island developing states, whose futures are dependent on our ability to adapt even to a 1.5 degree world. We are already struggling at 1.1 degrees with hurricanes, with sea level rise, flooding, droughts, etc. We're already struggling. And if we were to achieve this holy grail of 1.5, it simply means that things are kind of still look far worse than they currently are, let alone if we were to exceed that 1.5 limit. So that adaptation agenda is so critical. So as we move toward Glasgow, defining the global goal on adaptation is critical. It needs to have our fingerprints all over that. We should be driving that agenda. We should be active participants within the adaptation committee, again, defining the adaptation agenda, including pushing the adaptation registry, the adaptation communications, to ensure that adaptation is given equal treatment as mitigation. And then from a financing point of view, the whole issue of share of proceeds within Article 6, ensuring that that share is as large as possible in order to provide additional resources to the adaptation agenda. And then speaking of finances, it goes beyond just the 100 billion. It's taken us, we've climbed a mountain just to get developed nations to step up to their Paris pledges for the 100 billion. We now need to start the discussion about post-2025 financing, where billions are supposed to upscale to trillions. Those are the conversations that we need to be having in order to achieve our objectives, both in terms of achieving 1.5 and matching our adaptation requirements. So Fran, in closing, just moving back to your comment about leapfrogging, I think developing nations, especially small island developing states, have an incredible opportunity to embrace the new technologies, to be exemplars, both from a progressive policy development through to solution implementation and the embracing of technology, both in terms of decision making, but also in terms of leading the way, whether it is in renewable energies, whether it's in transport, whether it's in nature-based solutions, et cetera. We have an opportunity to lead there, and we're showing the ambition. We are demonstrating through our NDCs. The vulnerable nations are the ones who've been submitting their NDCs, ambitious NDCs. We are the ones who are developing progressive NAPs and progressive climate action, climate resilience programs. So we're showing leadership, but without the necessary financial and technical support to put those concepts, plans, visions, dreams into action, we need the support of the international community to do that. So we have an opportunity to link the challenges that we face with climate change to a positive national and regional development agendas. The opportunity is there, but we need the support. So Fran, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Minister. And I'd like to take on that last point, which is really important, because one of the things that the UNFCCC synthesis report pointed out was that a significant number of the NDCs are conditional on support, finance, technology, and capacity building. And then the OECD report noted between 2018 and 2019, at least climate finance to SIDS dropped by $600 million, which is obviously not on track to where we want to be. I know that we are essentially out of time, but I wanted to just quickly go back to our LDC chair to see if you had any comments in response to Minister Stiell's remarks, and then we will move to closing out. Chair?
Thank you, Francis. No, not really. I think we were on the, in terms of, on the same path, more about, at the end of the day, this adaptation finance. I think we need to do a lot of adaptation resilience building, and the gap currently is 70 billion. And what we have currently is, I think it's less than 10 billion, 9.8 billion or so, very, very little. And of that also, quite a bit of that is borrowing. So I think at the end of the day, climate finance for LDCs and developing countries to meet their targets, I think climate finance is critical, crucial. Without that, we cannot. And we've, in fact, there are COP decisions, CMA decisions, which has in fact required us to do our NAPs. And then the NAPs should be, everything is there in the NAPs. It should be, and NAPs are also part of NDCs. So it should be financed by, there should be a COP decision or CMA decision for GCF to finance. I mean, again, to go and you know, in terms of the bureaucracy with these climate finance agencies, it could be 4 or 5 years before we could get the money. So I totally agree with the minister's statement. I think more or less we were on the same path on everything, whichever in terms of who needs to reduce, in terms of what is needed. So I think it's very clear. Just a little question, when I have the floor. A couple of my LDC countries have also, in fact, were concerned. We are, in fact, there was presentation from Climate Tracker. I believe Climate Tracker is doing a good job. But we have, in fact, LDCs are the smallest emitters. Most of our industries are primary, and most of us actually could be quite green. And in particular, Bhutan. Bhutan is the only carbon negative country in the world. And the Climate Tracker doesn't recognize that. Bhutan, in fact, in terms of its emissions, is 1/3 of its sink. And Bhutan has a considerable, again, offset. We have about close to, by 2030, 22 million tons of carbon offsets currently happening in India. So Bhutan will, in fact, we will never be able to use our sink capacity. Our emissions are like 3.8 million tons. Our sink is like 9.5 million tons. And there have been in the previous NDCs, I believe it could be something to do ratio analysis, because since we didn't have data, if they talked about waste, say that this time around waste increased by 400%, it was because they didn't have data at that time. We are 750,000 people. So you had data for 50,000 people. Now today we have data for all. So the one you have from 40,000, it increased to, let's say, 150,000 tons. Now 150,000 tons is not going to increase 400% henceforth. It'll increase by 2-3%. So my request is to Climate Tracker, because LDCs are concerned. We in fact sometimes wonder whose side it is on. That confidence building, you have to recognize reality. And Bhutan is the only climate negative country in the world. But if you look at climate, the tracker, recently they updated, but last time we were worst of the worst. We were beyond even the 3-degree group. So my request is to, it's not, I don't want any response. I didn't know, I tried to reach out, but this is, since everyone is there, please take note of this information. And also, this, I think you need to celebrate those who have achieved, and Bhutan has done that. It has impeccable credentials in terms of environment. 51% of our land is reserved as parks, forests, animal sanctuaries. 72% forest cover, written into the constitution that it should never fall below 60% and carbon negative. Thank you. I won't take your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you for your feedback. I will be sure to make sure to pass this on to the CAT colleagues, and I don't know if my colleagues wanted to respond with any other remarks there. Okay. Thank you so much, Chair, and definitely for that feedback. I'll be sure to pass it on. Now, looking at the time, I am going to close and wrap up. Minister Stiell, Chair, thank you very much for your participation. Our presenters here today from Climate Analytics. Yes, the entire session has been recorded and will be available online for those who would like to listen to it afterwards, and it will be shared with all participants who have been registered. Like the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda said in ASS Leaders Summit yesterday, and Minister Stiell and the chair of the LDC group mentioned today, 1.5 is not a win for SIDS and LDCs. It is still going to be seeing many impacts and lots of impacts to come. It is a stark picture that has been painted, but as Carl noted, 1.5 is most certainly within reach. But we do need near-term action. And our panelists today outlined some of those clear steps that are required, not just now, but in the run-up to COP and subsequently as we go forward in this decade of action. We have a few critical moments in the run-up to COP. Here at the UN General Assembly, the G20 Summit, the pre-COP, the IMF and World Bank annual meetings in October, which are critical moments to be able to take decisions, especially as it relates to financing of fossil fuels. And I will note, we do have ambitious action on the table through SIDS and LDCs, NDCs, as well as other developing countries, but there is most certainly a need for finance. That is one of the critical points that have come out of the discussion today, not just finance as it relates to private finance in loans, but access to finance is a critical component of that, direct access in the form of grant, especially to SIDS and LDCs in concessional forms. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining today. Thank you all for your contribution and for listening in and for your questions and your engagement in the question and answer session. Thank you all very much and have a good rest of your week.